A flight attendant slaps a black mom mid-flight, humiliating her in front of passengers. But 3 minutes later, the entire plane is in shock, because the woman she just attacked isn't just any passenger. And now, the woman who thought she had all the power is about to lose everything. What happens when the truth comes out? And what lesson will this woman teach her before delivering the ultimate punishment? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The afternoon sun streamed through the airport's towering windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor of the bustling terminal. 6-year-old Elijah Carter bounced on his toes, his small hand firmly wrapped in his mother's as they made their way through the crowd. His Spider-Man backpack hung from Vanessa's shoulder, swaying with each step. "Look, Mommy, that plane is huge." Elijah pointed excitedly at a massive aircraft visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Vanessa smiled down at her son, her heart warming at his enthusiasm. "That's right, sweetie. And we'll be flying on one just like it today." They approached the first-class check-in counter, where a blonde attendant in a crisp blue uniform sat. The woman's welcoming smile faltered slightly as they drew closer, her eyes darting between Vanessa's casual attire and her son. "Good afternoon," Vanessa said pleasantly, sliding her ID and confirmation across the counter. "Checking in for the Chicago flight." The attendant's perfectly manicured fingers hesitated over the keyboard. She picked up Vanessa's ID, studying it with exaggerated care, then looked back at the computer screen. "First class?" she asked, her tone carrying a hint of doubt. "Yes," Vanessa replied simply, her voice steady and confident. The attendant's lips pressed into a thin line as she clicked through several screens, taking far longer than necessary. Elijah, always observant, noticed the way the woman kept glancing up at his mother with narrowed eyes. Finally, the printer whirred to life, and the attendant handed over their boarding passes with obvious reluctance. "Gate B12, she said curtly, already looking past them to the next person in line. As they walked away, Elijah tugged on his mother's hand. "Mommy, why was she staring at you like that?" His brown eyes were filled with confusion and concern. Vanessa stopped and knelt beside him, straightening the collar of his favorite dinosaur t-shirt. Her voice was gentle but firm as she spoke. "Some people don't think we belong in certain places, but we always do." She brushed a curl from his forehead. "Remember what I always tell you? We deserve to be anywhere we want to be," Elijah recited proudly. "That's right, baby." Vanessa stood, squeezing his hand. "Now let's go find our gate." The boarding process began smoothly enough. They made their way down the jet bridge, Elijah chattering excitedly about the window seat he'd been promised. As they entered the first-class cabin, Vanessa helped him settle into 2A, making sure his backpack was safely stowed under the seat in front of him. Across the aisle, a white businessman in an expensive suit barely looked up from his Wall Street Journal, though his eyes occasionally drifted their way. Further back, just beyond the curtain separating first class from coach, an elderly black woman caught Vanessa's eye and gave her a knowing, supportive nod. "Can I have my tablet now?" Elijah asked, bouncing slightly in his leather seat. "Once we're in the air, sweetheart," Vanessa promised, helping him with his seatbelt. The click of heels on the carpet announced the arrival of Rachel Myers, the senior flight attendant. Her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and pristine uniform projected an image of authority, but there was something cold in her blue eyes as they landed on Vanessa and Elijah. Rachel approached their seats, her lips curved in an artificial smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ma'am, can I help you find your correct seat?" Her voice dripped with false sweetness. Vanessa looked up calmly. "We're in our correct seats, thank you." She reached for her boarding pass and held it out. Rachel barely glanced at the document before speaking again, her tone sharper now. "You must have found that somewhere. First class isn't open for upgrades from economy." Elijah's small hand found his mother's, squeezing tightly. The businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper slightly, watching the scene unfold. From Coach, the elderly black woman shook her head, her expression a mixture of sadness and resignation. "I assure you, these are our assigned seats," Vanessa said evenly, though her jaw had tightened slightly. Rachel's face hardened, her pretense of politeness cracking. She reached for the intercom handset, her eyes never leaving Vanessa. "Security to the first-class cabin," she announced, her voice clipped. "We have a passenger refusing to cooperate." Before anyone could react, Rachel's hand shot out, striking Vanessa across the face with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent cabin. Elijah burst into tears, pressing himself against his mother's side. "Mommy," he sobbed, his small body shaking. Scattered gasps arose from the surrounding passengers. The businessman's newspaper dropped to his lap, his mouth hanging open. Whispers rippled through the cabin, growing louder with each passing second. Rachel stood there, a triumphant smirk playing at the corners of her mouth as she waited for Vanessa to crumble, to gather her things and slink away in shame. But Vanessa didn't move. She didn't cry out or raise her hand to her reddening cheek. Instead, she reached into her purse with deliberate calmness and withdrew her phone. Her fingers moved across the screen with precise, unhurried movements as she dialed a number, her expression eerily composed despite the handprint blooming on her face. The cabin had grown so quiet that the soft beeping of the phone's keys seemed unnaturally loud. Rachel's smirk began to falter as she watched Vanessa's unwavering composure, the first flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. The silence in the cabin seemed to stretch endlessly as Vanessa held the phone to her ear. Her expression remained perfectly composed, betraying nothing of her thoughts or feelings. Only the angry red mark on her cheek gave any indication of what had just transpired. Elijah continued to sob quietly against her side, his small fingers clutching the fabric of her blouse. Vanessa's free hand stroked his back in gentle, soothing circles, even as she spoke in hushed tones into the phone. The businessman across the aisle leaned forward in his seat, his newspaper completely forgotten now. His brows furrowed as he strained to catch Vanessa's whispered words. Other passengers craned their necks, the tension in the cabin thick enough to cut with a knife. From her spot just beyond the curtain dividing first class from coach, the elderly black woman watched the scene unfold with knowing eyes. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her chin raised slightly as if in silent prayer. Rachel stood in the aisle, arms crossed over her pristine uniform, a smug smile still playing at the corners of her mouth. She rocked slightly on her heels, clearly pleased with herself. To her, this was just another day of putting people in their place, people who dared to step above their station. "It's okay, baby," Vanessa murmured to Elijah between speaking into the phone. "Everything's going to be all right." Her son hiccuped and pressed closer, his tears dampening her blouse. The cabin fell into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the steady hum of the engines and Elijah's occasional sniffles. Passengers exchanged uncertain glances, some typing furiously on their phones, others whispering behind cupped hands. Then, exactly 3 minutes after Vanessa had dialed her phone, the pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. The sound made several passengers jump. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." His voice was tight, controlled. "Due to an emergency situation, we are diverting this flight immediately. The flight crew is under emergency review. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The change in Rachel's demeanor was instant and dramatic. The smug smile vanished from her face as if it had been wiped away. Her crossed arms dropped to her sides, and her perfectly maintained posture seemed to collapse in on itself. "What?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Her face had gone pale, making her red lipstick stand out starkly against her skin. The plane banked sharply to the left, causing several passengers to grab their armrests. The sudden movement sent Rachel stumbling slightly, forcing her to grab the back of a nearby seat to steady herself. All around the cabin, confused passengers looked at one another. Some pulled out their phones, checking flight tracking apps or sending messages. The other flight attendants hurried up and down the aisles, their movements quick and nervous as they checked seatbelts and secured loose items. Rachel spun on her heel and practically ran to the cockpit. Through the now open curtain, passengers could see her speaking urgently to the co-pilot, who had stepped out into the galley. Her hands moved in sharp, agitated gestures, but the co-pilot kept his eyes fixed on the floor, refusing to meet her increasingly desperate gaze. When she returned to the first-class cabin, Rachel's entire demeanor had changed. Gone was the condescending authority, replaced by something approaching panic. She approached Vanessa's seat again, wringing her hands. "Listen," she said, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "I didn't mean anything by it. Let's not make a big deal out of this." She attempted a smile that came out more like a grimace. "We can work this out, can't we?" Vanessa finally looked up from comforting Elijah. She tilted her head slightly, studying Rachel with the kind of calm intensity that made the flight attendant take an involuntary step backward. "Did you think I would just let this go?" Vanessa's voice was quiet but carried clearly in the hushed cabin. Rachel swallowed hard, her throat bobbing visibly. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple, despite the cool air conditioning. Across the aisle, the businessman let out a low chuckle. "Oh, you're in for it now," he muttered, shaking his head with obvious satisfaction. The plane began its descent, banking again as it approached what was clearly not their intended destination. Through the windows, passengers could see they were heading toward a private airstrip, where several black vehicles were already lined up along the tarmac. As they touched down, Rachel's face went from pale to ashen. She gripped the back of an empty seat so hard her knuckles turned white, staring out the window at the gathering crowd outside. Even from the air, it was clear this was no ordinary welcoming committee. Men and women in business suits stood in a loose cluster, their faces grave. Security personnel in dark uniforms formed a perimeter around the area. And perhaps most terrifyingly, several news vans were parked at the edge of the tarmac, their satellite dishes already extending toward the sky. The plane came to a complete stop and a heavy silence fell over the cabin. Rachel's breathing had become shallow and rapid, her chest rising and falling in quick, uneven movements. Her perfectly styled hair had begun to fall out of place and a slight tremor ran through her hands. Vanessa stood slowly, her movements deliberate and controlled. Elijah remained close to her side. His tears had dried, but his eyes were still red and puffy. With careful precision, she removed her sunglasses, revealing eyes that were sharp and focused. When she spoke, her voice was cold yet perfectly composed, carrying clearly through the silent cabin. "Rachel," she said, "I own this airline." Rachel's knees buckled, and she had to grab the seat again to keep from falling. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. The realization of exactly what she had done, and to whom she had done it, seemed to hit her all at once, and what little color remained drained from her face. Sometime later, the plane door opened with a soft hiss, and immediately, a barrage of camera flashes lit up the entrance. Rachel squinted against the bright lights, her legs still shaky as she pressed herself against the galley wall, trying to make herself as small as possible. But there was nowhere to hide from what was unfolding before her. A group of airline executives in crisp suits rushed forward across the tarmac, their faces a mixture of concern and deference as they approached the aircraft. Leading them was James Morton, the airline's chief operating officer. Rachel recognized him from the company newsletters. Behind him came Sarah Chen, head of human resources, and at least half a dozen other senior officials Rachel had only ever seen in corporate photographs. "Mrs. Carter," Morton called out, his voice carrying a note of urgency. "We came as soon as we got your call. This is completely unacceptable." Vanessa stepped into view, her posture straight and dignified despite the red mark still visible on her cheek. Elijah clung to her hand, his small face peeking out from behind her leg as he took in the crowd of people and the flashing cameras. His eyes were wide with uncertainty, and his free hand clutched his stuffed dinosaur tighter. "Mommy," he whispered, tugging at her hand. His voice trembled slightly. "Are we in trouble?" The question seemed to pierce through the chaos of the moment. Vanessa knelt down beside him, her movements graceful despite her anger. She cupped his face in her hands and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead. "Not us, baby," she said softly, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Not us." Rachel watched this tender moment with growing horror, the full weight of her actions crashing down upon her. She had slapped this woman, the owner of the airline, in front of her young son. Her stomach churned as she realized just how badly she had miscalculated. Two security officers in dark uniforms appeared at Rachel's side, their faces stern. "Ma'am, you need to come with us," one of them said, taking her arm firmly but professionally. "Wait," Rachel protested, trying to pull away. "This is all a misunderstanding, I can explain." But her words fell on deaf ears as they led her away from the aircraft. As they passed through the terminal, Rachel caught sight of Jenny, a flight attendant she'd worked with for the past 5 years. "Jenny!" she called out desperately. "Jenny, please tell them this isn't like me." But Jenny turned away, refusing to meet Rachel's eyes. The rejection stung more than Rachel expected. She and Jenny had shared countless layovers together, had gone shopping in foreign cities, had celebrated each other's birthdays. Now Jenny wouldn't even look at her. Meanwhile, Vanessa was being escorted to a private lounge, Elijah's hand still firmly in hers. The room was elegant but understated, with comfortable leather chairs and a view of the airfield. Sarah Chen personally poured Vanessa a glass of water, her hands shaking slightly as she handed it over. "Mrs. Carter," Morton began, his voice heavy with contrition, "we cannot begin to express how deeply sorry we are for this incident. This kind of behavior is completely contrary to our values as an airline, and—" Vanessa took a slow, deliberate sip of water before cutting him off. "I don't want apologies," she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "I want change." The executives exchanged nervous glances. Before they could respond, there was a commotion at the door. Rachel burst in, having somehow broken away from security. Her perfectly styled hair was now disheveled, her uniform wrinkled and her eyes wild with panic. "Please," she cried out, her voice cracking. "You have to understand, I was stressed. The flight was delayed. Passengers were being difficult. I didn't mean it." The words tumbled out in a desperate rush. "It's all just a misunderstanding." Vanessa carefully set her glass down on the side table. The soft clink of glass against wood seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the room. She turned to face Rachel, her gaze steady and unflinching. "No, Rachel," she said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly across the room. "This is about more than today. This is about the dozens of passengers you've belittled, ignored, and humiliated for years." She leaned forward slightly in her chair. "You just picked the wrong one today." Rachel's face crumpled. The facade of the confident, authoritative flight attendant was completely gone now, replaced by raw fear. She sank into a chair across from Vanessa, her legs no longer able to support her. "Please," she whispered, "don't destroy my career. This job is all I have." Vanessa studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of carefully considered judgment. "You think you've lost everything?" she asked, her voice taking on an edge of ice. "No, Rachel. Losing everything means facing the reality of what you've done." She leaned forward, her eyes locked onto Rachel's. "So before I fire you, you're going to learn exactly what that means." Rachel shivered visibly, shrinking back in her chair. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the implications of Vanessa's words sank in. This wasn't going to be a simple termination. This was going to be something far more profound and painful. The security officers who had followed Rachel into the room now stood at attention, waiting for instructions. The airline executives remained silent, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and stern approval for Vanessa's handling of the situation. And through it all, Elijah sat quietly beside his mother, his young face showing a wisdom beyond his years as he watched Rachel tremble in her seat. Days later, the harsh buzz of Rachel's doorbell jolted her awake at 4:30 a.m. Groaning, she stumbled to her front door, still wearing her silk pajamas. 2 airline security officers stood on her doorstep, their expressions neutral but firm. "Ms. Myers," one of them said, holding out a folded bundle of cloth. "Get dressed. Your training begins in 30 minutes." Rachel blinked at the garment they handed her. It wasn't the crisp, professional flight attendant uniform she was used to. Instead, she held a rough, navy blue jumpsuit, the kind worn by ground crew workers. Her stomach dropped as she read the patch sewn onto the chest. "Trainee." "This must be a mistake," she protested, trying to hand it back. "I'm a senior flight attendant." "Not anymore," the second officer replied flatly. "Mrs. Carter's orders. You have 15 minutes to change and come with us." In her bathroom, Rachel stared at her reflection as she zipped up the coarse jumpsuit. The fabric felt alien against her skin, nothing like the smooth polyester blend of her flight attendant uniform. She tried to fix her hair and apply some makeup, but the officers called out that her time was up. The drive to the airport was silent. Rachel watched the familiar buildings pass by, but everything felt different from the passenger seat of a security vehicle. They didn't drop her at the main terminal where she usually entered. Instead, they drove around to the back where cargo planes and service vehicles clustered together. A weathered woman in her 50s wearing the same type of jumpsuit waited for them. Her name tag read, Gloria. "Welcome to ground crew," Gloria said, her voice carrying no warmth. "First stop, lavatory service." Rachel's eyes widened in horror as Gloria led her to a service truck. "You mean?" "Yes, Ms. Myers, we're cleaning airplane toilets today." The morning passed in a blur of harsh cleaning chemicals and the unmistakable smell of waste. Rachel's perfectly manicured nails chipped as she scrubbed toilet bowls. Her carefully styled hair fell flat under the required safety cap. Every time she thought it couldn't get worse, Gloria would appear with another task, another airplane, another mess to clean. By mid-morning, they switched to the baggage handling area. Rachel's arms ached as she lifted suitcases onto conveyor belts. She recognized some of the passengers walking by, the same types of people she used to serve in first class. Now they looked right through her as if she were invisible. "Hey, new girl," a baggage handler called out. "Those bags aren't going to load themselves." Rachel flinched at being addressed so casually. She wanted to remind them who she was, but the words died in her throat as she caught Gloria watching her. Instead, she bent down to lift another heavy suitcase, her back protesting the movement. At noon, Gloria pointed her toward the employee break room. 30 minutes for lunch," she said curtly. "Don't be late coming back." The break room was small and cramped, nothing like the crew lounges Rachel was used to. She sat alone in a corner with her packed lunch, trying to ignore the stains on her jumpsuit and the dirt under her broken nails. A group of ground crew workers sat at a nearby table talking among themselves. Rachel tried to tune them out until she heard her own name. "Yeah, that Rachel Myers," one of them said. "Remember last month? That older black lady in the wheelchair?" Rachel's sandwich turned to ash in her mouth as she listened. "The poor woman just needed help getting her medication from her carry-on," another voice added. "Myers walked right past her like she wasn't even there. The lady nearly had an anxiety attack before another passenger helped her." "That's not the only time," a third voice chimed in. "Remember the Hispanic family she made cry because their English wasn't perfect?" Each story hit Rachel like a physical blow. She remembered these incidents, but at the time, she'd dismissed them as unimportant. Now, hearing them from the perspective of these workers, she felt sick to her stomach. The afternoon brought more physical labor. Rachel folded hundreds of airline blankets, her arms burning from the repetitive motion. She restocked beverage carts, cleaned windows, and emptied trash bins. Every task reminded her of how she used to treat the people who did this work daily. By evening, her whole body screamed in protest. Her designer shoes, completely inappropriate for the day's work, had given her blisters. Her back ached from lifting, her hands were red and raw from cleaning chemicals, and her feet felt like they were on fire. As her shift finally ended, Rachel collapsed onto a bench outside the employee entrance. The same bench, she realized with a jolt, where she'd often seen ground crew workers resting, people she'd previously dismissed as lazy. Looking down at her calloused hands, Rachel felt something she'd never experienced before. She felt small. All her years of authority, her carefully cultivated superiority, her pride in her position, none of it meant anything now. She was just another worker in a jumpsuit, invisible to the very people she used to look down upon. A shadow fell across her, and Rachel looked up to find Gloria standing there, holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Carter wants your first day report," Gloria said, her voice neutral. "Should I tell her you're ready for day 2? Rachel opened her mouth to protest, to argue, to demand her old position back, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she just nodded, too exhausted to fight. As Gloria walked away, Rachel caught her reflection in a window. Her makeup had long since worn off, her hair was a mess, and her jumpsuit was stained with the evidence of a hard day's work. For the first time in her career, she saw herself clearly, and she didn't like what she saw. But this was only day one, and somehow Rachel knew Vanessa Carter was just getting started. The next day, the morning sun hadn't yet risen when Rachel's alarm blared through her apartment. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest as she tried to sit up. Her arms felt like lead weights, and her back spasmed with each movement. Yesterday's physical labor had taken its toll in ways she'd never experienced before. Standing in front of her bathroom mirror, Rachel winced at her reflection. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usually perfect hair hung limp and lifeless. She'd soaked in a hot bath last night, trying to ease her aching muscles, but it hadn't helped much. As she reached for her makeup bag, her hands trembled slightly, still raw from the harsh cleaning chemicals. The coarse fabric of the jumpsuit felt even more foreign against her skin today. Each button seemed to mock her as she slowly fastened them, her fingers stiff and uncooperative. The name patch still read trainee, a constant reminder of her fall from grace. Through her apartment window, she heard voices approaching, the familiar chatter of ground crew members heading to their morning shift. Rachel instinctively moved to peer out, then froze as she caught fragments of their conversation. "Did you see Myers yesterday? Little Miss Perfect scrubbing toilets?" Laughter erupted, followed by another voice. "Bet she's never done an honest day's work in her life. Did you see how she was holding that mop?" More laughter. Rachel's cheeks burned as she stepped away from the window. Just last week, these same workers would have lowered their voices and stepped aside when she walked past. Now she was the subject of their jokes. The security officers arrived right on schedule, their knock sharp and professional. Rachel grabbed her bag, trying to ignore how her muscles protested every movement. In the car, she noticed they weren't heading toward the maintenance area like yesterday. Instead, they pulled up to the main terminal building. Gloria waited by the employee entrance, clipboard in hand. "Different assignment today, Myers," she said, leading Rachel through a maze of corridors. They stopped at a door marked Customer Relations Department. "Mrs. Carter wants you to handle some specific complaints." The office was a stark contrast to the luxury of first-class cabins Rachel was used to. Rows of gray cubicles stretched across a fluorescent-lit room, each equipped with a basic telephone and computer. Gloria directed her to a cubicle in the corner. "These are recordings and written complaints from passengers who've experienced discrimination on our flights," Gloria explained, placing a thick folder on the desk. "You'll listen to each one, then call the passengers personally to apologize." Rachel's stomach clenched as she opened the folder. The first complaint form had her name clearly printed in the staff member involved field. So did the second. And the third. "Start with the recorded complaints," Gloria instructed, showing her how to access the audio files. "Mrs. Carter wants you to hear their voices." The first recording started playing through Rachel's headset. A woman's voice, thick with emotion, described trying to pre-board with her infant son. Rachel remembered the incident. She'd assumed the woman's first-class ticket was fake, making her wait until final boarding. The baby had been crying. "My son was hungry and tired," the woman's voice continued. "I showed her my ticket 3 times, but she kept saying there must be a mistake. I've never felt so humiliated." Rachel's hand shook as she dialed the number listed on the complaint form. After 3 rings, a voice answered. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson. This is Rachel Myers from Alliance Airlines." Her voice wavered. "I'm calling about the incident last month when you were trying to pre-board with your son." Silence filled the line for a moment. "I remember you," Mrs. Thompson said coldly. "I'm calling to apologize. What I did was wrong. I made assumptions about you that were racist, and I treated you and your son terribly." The words felt like glass in Rachel's throat. Another long pause. "Do you know my son cried for 2 hours straight? Do you know how it felt to have other passengers staring at us, wondering what I'd done wrong?" "I'm so sorry," Rachel whispered. "Keep your sorry," Mrs. Thompson replied. "It's too little, too late." The line went dead. The next complaint was from an elderly Asian woman whom Rachel had mocked for her accent. Then a Middle Eastern man she'd made sit apart from his family because she couldn't verify their relationship. A Hispanic teenager she'd accused of stealing from the beverage cart when he was just reaching for his asthma inhaler. Each call was harder than the last. Some passengers hung up as soon as they heard her name. Others listened to her apologies in stony silence. A few yelled, their anger still fresh months later. Only one person accepted her apology, and even then the woman added, "I hope you really understand what you did." By lunch break, Rachel's voice was hoarse from apologizing, and her cheeks were wet with tears. She hadn't realized she was crying. In the break room, other employees moved away from her table, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The afternoon brought more complaints, more calls, more confrontations with her own behavior. Each recording forced her to relive moments she'd dismissed as unimportant, moments that had clearly left deep wounds in others. A mother described how Rachel's dismissive eye roll had made her daughter afraid to ask for help during future flights. A businessman recalled how Rachel had checked his first-class ticket 3 times while letting white passengers walk right past. An elderly woman detailed how Rachel had ignored her requests for assistance with her luggage, leaving her struggling alone. As the day drew to a close, Rachel sat alone in the break room, her untouched coffee growing cold. The voices from the complaints echoed in her head, angry, hurt, frustrated, resigned. Each one had a story, a family, feelings she'd carelessly trampled. "I really did all that," she whispered to herself, the words barely audible in the empty room. It wasn't a question anymore, but a devastating realization. Every complaint, every angry voice, every tear-filled story, they were all because of her. The weight of this truth settled heavy on her shoulders, far heavier than any luggage she'd lifted yesterday. The next day, the morning air felt thick with tension as Rachel entered the large conference room. Her steps faltered when she saw the circle of chairs, most already occupied by women of various ethnicities. Their faces were familiar. She'd passed them in hallways, shared break rooms with them, but had never really seen them. Until now. Vanessa stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding attention without effort. She wore a simple black blazer and slacks, but carried herself with the quiet authority that came from owning the airline. When Rachel entered, several heads turned, and the low murmur of conversation died. "Sit down, Rachel," Vanessa said, gesturing to an empty chair. Her voice was neither kind nor cruel, simply matter of fact. "You never cared to hear their stories before. Today, you will." Rachel's legs felt wooden as she made her way to the chair. She could feel eyes following her movement, some curious, others hostile. The chair creaked as she sat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Ladies," Vanessa addressed the group, "thank you for coming today. I know it wasn't easy for many of you to return here. Please, share your experiences with us." A black woman in her early 30s cleared her throat. Rachel recognized her, Sarah Jenkins, a former flight attendant who'd quit 6 months ago. Sarah's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. "I worked here for 5 years, Sarah began, her voice steady despite her rigid posture. "Every month, without fail, I was assigned the worst shifts. Red eyes, holiday rotations, last-minute schedule changes. When I complained to management, they said it was random assignment, but I noticed the white attendants got their preferred schedules more often than not." Sarah's eyes met Rachel's directly. "You were crew leader then, Rachel. Remember when I asked you about it? You told me to stop playing the race card and be grateful for the job." Rachel felt her face grow hot. She remembered that conversation, remembered dismissing Sarah's concerns with barely a thought. "The schedule wasn't the worst part," Sarah continued. "It was the isolation. Team dinners, coffee breaks, birthday celebrations. Somehow my invitations always got lost. 5 years of watching my colleagues build friendships while I ate alone in the break room." A Latina woman spoke next, Maria Gonzalez. Her accent was slight but noticeable. "I loved being a flight attendant," she said, a sad smile playing at her lips. "But every day, someone would mock how I pronounced things. Passengers, crew members, even you, Rachel." Rachel shifted uncomfortably in her chair as Maria continued. "You would imitate my accent when giving instructions during crew meetings. Everyone would laugh. I tried to speak up, but you said I was being too sensitive." Maria's voice cracked slightly. "After 3 years, I couldn't take it anymore. I quit last spring. Aisha Khan, a former Muslim flight attendant, spoke next. Her hijab was a deep burgundy, matching her professional attire. Security checks were my daily nightmare, she said, her voice calm, but her eyes reflecting old pain. Every single shift I was pulled aside for random screening. My white colleagues walked through without a second glance, but I had to arrive an hour early just to get through security. She leaned forward, addressing Rachel directly. You saw it happen every day. You were my supervisor. You could have spoken up, could have questioned why only certain crew members faced these random checks. Instead, you told me it was protocol and that I should understand the times we live in. One by one, more women shared their stories. A Korean-American flight attendant described how passengers would ask to be served by a real American, while Rachel stood by silently. A black customer service representative recalled how Rachel had questioned her presence in the first-class lounge, despite her wearing a staff uniform. Each story hit Rachel like a physical blow. These weren't just complaints from passengers she'd never see again. These were women she'd worked with, women whose careers she'd impacted, whose daily lives she'd made harder through her actions and inactions. The weight of their words became unbearable. Rachel felt her chest tighten, her breathing becoming shallow. This was too much, too many accusations, too many memories she'd dismissed, too many wrongs she couldn't right. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She turned toward the door, ready to flee, to escape these voices and these truths. But Vanessa's voice cut through the air like a whip. If you walk away now, you prove everything they said about you. Rachel froze mid-step, her hand halfway to the door handle. Her body trembled with the effort of holding still, caught between flight and facing the truth. For the first time in her career, Rachel had no defense, no clever explanation, no way to dismiss these women's experiences. Their stories formed an undeniable pattern, and she had been at the center of it all. Rachel's heels clicked against the polished floor as security escorted her to yet another meeting room. Her shoulders slumped with exhaustion from days of confronting her past behavior. When the door opened, she stopped dead in her tracks. Sitting at the small conference table was the elderly black woman from the flight, the one who had watched everything unfold from coach with knowing eyes. The woman's silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a pressed navy dress with a pearl necklace. Her posture was impeccable, her presence commanding respect without saying a word. Rachel's throat tightened. Something about this woman's dignified bearing made her feel smaller than all the previous confrontations combined. Mrs. Jackson is here to speak with you, the security guard said, gesturing for Rachel to take a seat. She flew in specifically for this meeting. Rachel's legs felt like lead as she made her way to the chair across from Mrs. Jackson. The older woman's eyes followed her movement, not with hatred or anger, but with something that made Rachel even more uncomfortable: understanding. Do you know why I was sitting in the coach that day? Mrs. Jackson asked once they were alone, her voice rich and measured. I could have afforded first class. I choose coach sometimes to remind myself of how far we've come and how far we haven't. She smoothed her skirt, a gesture that seemed to belong to another era. I flew before you were even born, young lady. Back then, I wasn't allowed to sit where I wanted. They had separate waiting areas, separate bathrooms, separate water fountains. Even when those laws changed, the attitudes didn't. Flight attendants would accidentally spill drinks on us, ignore our requests, make us wait until every white passenger was served. Rachel shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but Mrs. Jackson continued, her voice steady and clear. I was one of the first black women to file a discrimination lawsuit against an airline. Did you know that? They tried to say I was being difficult, that I was imagining things, but I kept detailed records of every incident, every slight, every time they treated me like I didn't belong. Mrs. Jackson reached into her handbag and pulled out an old, worn notebook. Its pages were yellowed with age, the corners soft from years of handling. I still keep my records. Old habits die hard. And seeing you treat that mother the way you did. She paused, shaking her head slowly. It broke my heart. Not just for her, but for you too. Rachel felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she remained silent. For once in her life, she had no excuse, no justification to offer. "You see," Mrs. Jackson continued, "I recognize that look in your eyes. I've seen it thousands of times, that certainty that some people don't belong in certain spaces, that need to put others in their place." She leaned forward slightly. "But let me tell you something about that certainty. It's a prison. It locks you up just as surely as it tries to lock others out." Mrs. Jackson opened her notebook, its pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. "Every time someone like you made me feel small, I wrote it down, not to bitter myself, but to remind myself that their smallness wasn't my burden to carry." She looked directly at Rachel. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" Rachel wanted to look away from those knowing eyes but couldn't. The weight of history in that gaze held her captive. "I don't hate you, child," Mrs. Jackson said softly, surprising Rachel with the gentleness in her voice. "But I pity you. Because all these years, while you've been trying to make others feel small, you've been shrinking yourself." The words hit Rachel like a physical blow. Her chest tightened, and she felt bile rising in her throat. Without warning, she pushed back from the table and ran from the room, barely making it to the bathroom in time. She retched violently into the toilet, her body expelling more than just her breakfast. When there was nothing left, she stumbled to the sink on shaky legs. The fluorescent lights of the bathroom were harsh and unforgiving as Rachel raised her eyes to the mirror. The face that stared back at her looked foreign, mascara smeared, complexion sallow, eyes red-rimmed and haunted. She barely recognized herself. Her hands gripped the cold porcelain of the sink as she whispered to her reflection, "I don't like who I am." The words hung in the air, echoing off the bathroom tiles, the truth of them impossible to take back or deny. For the first time, Rachel saw herself clearly, not as the powerful flight attendant who commanded respect, but as someone who had used that power to diminish others, to make herself feel important by making others feel small. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Rachel followed Vanessa's car in her own vehicle. She hadn't been told where they were going, only that she needed to be there by 8 a.m. sharp. After 20 minutes of driving through the city, they pulled up to a large brick building with stark white columns. Rachel squinted at the sign, National Civil Rights Museum. Her stomach clenched. She'd driven past this building countless times but had never once considered going inside. It had always seemed like someone else's history, someone else's problem. Vanessa waited for her at the entrance, her expression neutral but her eyes intense. Rachel noticed she wasn't dressed in her usual executive attire, but instead wore a simple black dress, as if in mourning. "Why are we here?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vanessa didn't answer immediately. Instead, she held the heavy glass door open, gesturing for Rachel to enter first. The cool air inside made Rachel shiver, or maybe it was the weight of silence that seemed to press down on her shoulders. They stood in the empty lobby, their footsteps echoing on the polished floor. The museum wouldn't open to the public for another hour. Vanessa had arranged for them to have this time alone. "You think racism is just words, Rachel?" Vanessa finally spoke, her voice carrying in the quiet space. She gestured at the walls around them, covered in black and white photographs of protests, violence, and resistance. "It's history, it's real, and it's ugly." Rachel's eyes darted from image to image, each one more disturbing than the last. She wanted to look away, but Vanessa's presence behind her made that impossible. "Start walking," Vanessa instructed. "Take your time, read everything." Rachel moved forward slowly, her heels clicking against the floor. The first exhibit showed the segregation era in stark detail. There were photographs of whites-only signs on water fountains, bathrooms, and waiting rooms. A preserved bus door stood in one corner, its steps worn by the feet of countless passengers who had to enter through the back because of their skin color. Her throat tightened as she saw images of black passengers being forcibly removed from segregated buses, their faces twisted in pain and humiliation. The violence in these photos wasn't ancient history. It had happened during her parents' lifetime. The next section focused on transportation discrimination. Rachel's steps faltered as she came face to face with a wall of flight attendant photographs from the 1960s. Row after row of smiling faces, all white, all perfectly coiffed, all representing an ideal of beauty and service that explicitly excluded women of color. Below the photos were newspaper clippings yellowed with age, but their words still sharp and clear. Headlines jumped out at her. Airlines accused of discriminatory hiring practices. Black passengers file class action lawsuit. Civil Rights Act challenges airline segregation. Rachel's hands began to shake when she recognized her own airline's name in one of the articles. The story detailed systematic discrimination against black passengers and employees throughout the 1960s and 70s. It wasn't some other airline's shame. It was her own company's history. Then she came to a wall that made her stop breathing. It stretched from floor to ceiling, covered in names etched in simple, dignified lettering. Above them, a bronze plaque read, "Victims of airline discrimination who fought for justice." Rachel's eyes moved down the list mechanically until they stopped on a familiar name. Her knees nearly buckled. "Mrs. Jackson," she whispered, reaching out to touch the engraved letters. The simple text beneath the name told a story that made Rachel's chest ache. First black woman to file discrimination lawsuit against Southern Airways, 1963. Case resulted in policy changes and established legal precedent for future civil rights cases in the airline industry. Rachel thought of Mrs. Jackson's dignified bearing, her knowing eyes, the way she had watched everything unfold on that fateful flight. She wasn't just a witness to history, she had helped shape it. She had fought battles that Rachel had never even acknowledged existed. The tears came without warning, hot and fast. Rachel's shoulders shook as she tried to contain her sobs, but it was useless. Everything she had seen, everything she had learned, crashed over her like a wave. The weight of history, real history, not the sanitized version she had chosen to believe, pressed down on her until she could barely stand. She turned to Vanessa, her vision blurred by tears. I didn't know," she choked out, the words feeling inadequate even as she spoke them. Vanessa's face remained unreadable, her eyes fixed on Rachel's. "You never wanted to know," she said simply. The truth of those words hit Rachel like a physical blow. She nodded, unable to speak. For the first time since this ordeal began, she truly accepted the truth. She had chosen ignorance. She had chosen to believe that her actions existed in a vacuum, that her treatment of passengers was just about maintaining standards rather than perpetuating a legacy of discrimination. She looked back at Mrs. Jackson's name on the wall, remembering how the older woman had said she pitied her. Now Rachel understood why. While Mrs. Jackson had fought to change history, Rachel had been actively trying to repeat it. Rachel stared at her warped reflection in the vending machine's glass, barely recognizing the woman looking back at her. Dark circles hung under her eyes, and her usually perfect makeup had started to smudge. Her head throbbed with the weight of everything she'd learned over the past few days. The endless stream of customer complaints, the devastating personal stories, and the crushing weight of historical truth she'd chosen to ignore for so long. The fluorescent lights of the break room hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across her face. She reached out and pressed her palm against the cool glass, trying to ground herself in the moment. The emptiness of the break room matched the hollow feeling in her chest. She felt exhausted, ashamed, and angry, though she wasn't sure anymore if she was angry at others or herself. Mostly, she just felt small, like she'd been stripped of all the self-importance she'd worn like armor for so many years. A movement reflected in the glass caught her attention. Rachel turned to find Vanessa standing in the doorway, watching her with that same unreadable expression she'd worn throughout this entire process. The airline owner's presence no longer filled Rachel with defensive anger. Instead, she felt exposed, like Vanessa could see right through her carefully constructed facades to the truth underneath. After what felt like an eternity of silence, Vanessa spoke. Her voice was neither harsh nor gentle, just matter of fact. "I have one last person for you to meet today." Rachel's shoulders slumped. She was too drained to argue, too exhausted to put up any resistance. What more could there possibly be? What else could she learn that she hadn't already? Without a word, she stood and followed Vanessa out of the break room. They walked through the quiet hallways of the office building, their footsteps echoing against the walls. Rachel noticed how different it felt to walk these halls now. halls she'd once strode through with such confidence and superiority. Now each step felt heavy, weighted down by the reality of who she'd been. Vanessa led her to a small conference room tucked away in a corner of the building. When she opened the door, Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Sitting at the table was a black woman in her early 40s, dressed professionally in a navy blue blazer. Her natural curls were styled elegantly, and her posture spoke of quiet dignity. Rachel recognized her immediately, though it had been years since she'd last seen her. Camille Jones. They'd worked together on numerous routes, though Rachel had never paid much attention to her back then. Camille had just been background noise in Rachel's world, another face in the crew, another person she'd looked past without really seeing. Camille's eyes met Rachel's, and there was no hatred in them, just a steady, unwavering gaze that made Rachel want to look away. But something told her that looking away now would be another act of cowardice. "Do you even remember me?" Camille asked, her voice calm but firm. Rachel's throat felt dry. You used to work on my routes," she managed to say, knowing how inadequate those words were even as they left her mouth. Camille nodded slowly, but her expression darkened slightly. "I did. Until you helped push me out." The words hit Rachel like a physical blow. She blinked in shock, her mind racing to understand. "What? I never—" But Camille didn't let her finish. Instead, she began to speak, her voice steady and clear, laying out truths that Rachel had never noticed, or more accurately, had chosen not to notice. "Every time the schedules came out, you got the premium routes with reasonable hours. I got back-to-back shifts with no breaks, working myself to exhaustion. When I complained about passengers touching my hair without permission, you rolled your eyes and told me to stop being so sensitive. When Mark started making comments about my unprofessional natural curls, you laughed right along with him." Each revelation felt like another weight being added to Rachel's shoulders. Memories started flooding back, moments she'd dismissed as unimportant, comments she'd made without thinking, situations she'd ignored because they didn't affect her directly. "There was the time I asked to switch shifts because my mother was in the hospital," Camille continued, her composure never wavering. "You told me I needed to get my priorities straight if I wanted to succeed in this industry. The same week you switched shifts with Sarah because she wanted to attend her dog's agility competition." Rachel's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she hadn't meant any harm, that she hadn't realized what she was doing. Finally, she stammered, I never meant to." Camille held up her hand, stopping Rachel mid-sentence. "Intent doesn't erase impact." The words were simple but devastating in their truth. Rachel looked away, shame burning hot in her chest. She could feel Vanessa's presence behind her, silent but watchful. The weight of everything, every thoughtless action, every dismissive comment, every moment of calculated indifference, pressed down on her until she could barely breathe. After what felt like an eternity of silence, Rachel swallowed hard. For the first time since this whole process began, she asked a real question, not to defend herself, not to minimize her actions, but to truly understand. "How did it feel?" Camille studied her for a long moment, as if weighing whether Rachel really wanted to know the truth. Then she answered, her words precise and honest. "Like drowning. And you stood there watching." Rachel felt her stomach twist violently. The metaphor was too perfect, too accurate. She had watched. She had known on some level what was happening, and she had done nothing. Worse than nothing. She had been an active participant in making another human being feel like they were drowning. Rachel lay in the narrow bed of her airline-provided dorm room, the scratchy sheets twisted around her legs from hours of restless tossing and turning. The digital clock on the nightstand cast a harsh red glow across the sparse room, marking each minute that slipped by without sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, Camille's words echoed in her mind. Like drowning. And you stood there watching. The ceiling above her became a screen where memories played out in vivid detail. She tried to push them away, to tell herself she hadn't been that bad. But each incident Camille had described rose up with crystal clarity, refusing to be dismissed. There was the time Camille had asked to switch shifts because of her hospitalized mother. Rachel remembered the exact tone of her own voice, dripping with condescension. "If you can't handle the schedule, maybe this isn't the right career for you." She'd said it so casually, as if she were doing Camille a favor by being honest. Then there was the morning meeting where Mark had made those comments about Camille's hair. Rachel could still hear her own laughter joining in, see the way Camille's shoulders had tensed, the way her hands had clenched around her coffee cup. At the time, Rachel had thought it was just harmless workplace banter. Now the memory made her stomach turn. The more she tried to justify her past actions, the more examples surfaced. The time she'd accidentally left Camille off the email chain about crew social events. The way she'd always managed to get the best routes while Camille got stuck with the exhausting red-eye flights. The countless times she'd walked past Camille struggling with difficult passengers without offering help. Rachel rolled onto her side, pulling the thin pillow over her head as if she could block out the thoughts. But they kept coming. She remembered the subtle smirk she'd share with other flight attendants when Camille would speak up in meetings, the way she'd deliberately mispronounce Camille's last name, even after being corrected multiple times. "I wasn't that bad," she whispered into the darkness. But the words sounded hollow even to her own ears, because now she could see it all clearly. Every dismissive gesture, every backhanded comment, every moment she'd used her position to make someone else feel small. Camille had been right about everything. Sleep never came that night. Rachel watched the sun rise through the small window, casting pale light across the industrial carpet. Her body felt heavy with exhaustion, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. When she walked into training the next morning, dark circles under her eyes, she expected, hoped for, some relief. Maybe today would be easier. Maybe she'd done enough soul-searching. Instead, Vanessa stood waiting for her, holding a thick stack of printed documents. Without a word, she handed them to Rachel, who took them with slightly trembling hands. Rachel flipped through the first few pages, her heart sinking lower with each one. The papers were filled with formal complaints, dozens of them, all filed against her over the years. Some she vaguely remembered. The Asian businessmen she'd repeatedly ignored while fawning over the white passengers in first class. The elderly Indian woman she'd accused of trying to steal extra blankets. The black mother she'd made wait until last to board despite her having a fussy infant. Other complaints she hadn't even known about. A Hispanic teenager who'd written about how Rachel had made him feel ashamed for speaking Spanish to his grandmother. A Muslim woman who detailed how Rachel had loudly questioned the authenticity of her dietary restrictions. A black father who'd described how Rachel had demanded to see his ticket 3 separate times while white passengers walked past unchallenged. Vanessa stood with her arms folded, watching Rachel's face as she read. "Do you know what I see, Rachel? A pattern. You weren't just rude on one bad day. You did this repeatedly." Rachel's hands trembled harder, causing the papers to rustle. She started, but Vanessa cut her off. "You never got fired before because people like you always get second chances. People like Camille don't." The words hit Rachel like a physical blow. She felt sick to her stomach as she realized the truth of it. How many times had she received nothing more than a gentle talking to from supervisors when passengers complained? How many times had she watched black and brown colleagues get written up for far less serious infractions? She sank into a nearby chair, the stack of complaints heavy in her lap. Each page felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She began to read them again, more carefully this time. Each complaint described not just what she'd done, but how it had made people feel. Humiliated, degraded, less than human. One complaint particularly stood out. A young black woman who'd been traveling with her elderly grandmother. Rachel remembered the incident vaguely. She'd been annoyed because they were taking too long to store their bags. The complaint described how Rachel had snapped at them, made a show of checking their tickets multiple times, and then loudly announced to another flight attendant that some people shouldn't fly if they can't keep up. The woman had written, "What hurt most wasn't just the rudeness. It was knowing that my grandmother, who had lived through segregation, had to experience this treatment in 2023. I saw the shame in her eyes, the way she tried to hurry despite her arthritis, No one should have to feel that way. Rachel's vision blurred with tears as the full weight of her actions crashed over her. She'd spent years telling herself she was just doing her job, that she treated everyone the same, that people were too sensitive. But the evidence was right here in black and white, a documented history of cruelty, bias, and discrimination. "I wasn't just complicit," she whispered, the realization hitting her like a thunderbolt. "I was the villain." Tears stung her eyes as she continued to read, each complaint feeling like another punch to the gut. She had been the monster in countless people's stories, the reason they'd felt unwelcome, unsafe, unworthy. She'd wielded her position like a weapon, never stopping to consider the damage she was inflicting. Rachel stood in the airport terminal early the next morning, her body still heavy with exhaustion from a sleepless night. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her normally pristine appearance showed signs of strain. Vanessa approached her with purposeful steps, her expression unreadable as always, her posture radiating quiet authority. "One final assignment," Vanessa announced, handing Rachel an observer's badge, the plastic cool against Rachel's palm. "You're going to watch a real flight crew in action." Rachel took the badge, turning it over in her hands, assuming she'd be observing a routine shift, perhaps shadowing some senior flight attendants or monitoring the pre-flight procedures. A simple task, she thought. But when Vanessa led her toward Gate C-12, where a fully booked commercial flight was preparing for departure, the bustling activity and sea of passengers made Rachel realize this would be different. "You'll be invisible today," Vanessa explained, her voice firm but not unkind. "No interaction with the crew or passengers. Just watch, listen, pay attention." They boarded ahead of the passengers. Rachel followed Vanessa to the rear galley, where they could observe without being obvious. The flight attendants bustled around them, performing their pre-flight checks with practiced efficiency, calling out to each other as they verified safety equipment and prepared the cabin. As passengers began boarding, Rachel watched a black female flight attendant, her name tag read Jasmine, greet everyone with a warm smile that reached her eyes. When a well-dressed businessman in a tailored suit approached his first-class seat, Jasmine offered a friendly, "Good morning, sir." The man walked right past her as if she were part of the plane's furniture, not even glancing in her direction, his focus entirely on his phone. Rachel shifted uncomfortably, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her badge. She'd seen this kind of behavior countless times before, but something felt different now. She noticed the slight tightening around Jasmine's eyes, the way her smile remained professional but dimmed just a fraction, before she composed herself and greeted the next passenger with renewed warmth. At the gate, a Middle Eastern passenger was pulled aside for what the security officer called a random screening. Rachel watched the man's resignation as he stepped aside, his shoulders slumping slightly, his teenage daughter looking on with embarrassment, her cheeks flushing as she stared at her shoes. It was clear from his expression that this wasn't the first time this had happened to him. He complied without protest, the weariness in his movements telling its own story. The boarding continued. A young Latina mother made her way down the aisle, struggling with a crying baby and a diaper bag that kept slipping from her shoulder. Other passengers shot her irritated looks, some making exaggerated sighs or rolling their eyes. One man muttered something under his breath that made those around him snicker. The mother's face flushed with shame as she tried to quiet her child, her hands trembling slightly as she arranged their belongings, whispering soothing words in Spanish. Rachel's stomach churned, a sour taste rising in her throat. How many times had she been one of those people? How many times had she made that same annoyed face, or worse, made a snide comment to another flight attendant about some people not being able to control their kids? The memory of her own words echoed painfully in her mind. Then something caught her attention near the front of the plane. A black teenager, maybe 15 or 16, dressed in a neat button-down shirt, pressed the call button. A young white flight attendant with blonde hair pulled into a perfect ponytail approached him. Her name tag read Ashley, and her uniform was as immaculate as Rachel's had always been. "Excuse me," the teenager said politely, his voice carrying a slight tremor. "Could I please have some water?" Ashley's response made Rachel freeze. The flight attendant's lips curved into a dismissive smile, her eyes rolling slightly, her weight shifting to one hip. "We haven't even taken off yet," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "You'll have to wait until beverage service like everyone else." She emphasized the last two words as if they contained a hidden message. Rachel felt like she'd been punched in the gut, the air leaving her lungs in a rush. The tone, the body language, the subtle way Ashley emphasized everyone else. It was exactly how she used to act. She could see herself in every movement, every gesture, every micro-expression of superiority. It was like watching a video of herself from another angle. The teenager slumped in his seat, clearly used to such treatment, his eyes dropping to his lap. A white passenger 2 rows ahead pressed their call button moments later, and Rachel watched as Ashley responded with genuine warmth, her entire demeanor transforming. She immediately fetched water without question, even adding ice and a lemon wedge with a flourish. Throughout the flight, Rachel couldn't take her eyes off Ashley. It was like watching a recording of herself from just a week ago, a mirror reflecting back every uncomfortable truth. The way Ashley would hover near the white passengers in first class, anticipating their needs while ignoring others. How she'd speak slowly and loudly to anyone with an accent, assuming they couldn't understand English properly. The subtle ways she'd make certain passengers feel like they were imposing just by existing in her space. Each interaction felt like a mirror being held up to Rachel's past behavior. She saw herself in every dismissive gesture, every fake smile, every moment of selective attention. The realization made her feel physically ill, a cold sweat breaking out across her forehead as her hands trembled. When the flight landed and the passengers disembarked, Rachel remained rooted in place, her mind replaying everything she'd witnessed. The cabin emptied, leaving only scattered newspapers and forgotten items in its wake. She barely noticed when Vanessa appeared beside her, the older woman's presence solid and grounding. Finally, Rachel turned to face her boss, her voice barely above a whisper, cracking with emotion. "I was her, wasn't I?" Vanessa nodded slowly, her eyes holding Rachel's gaze with unwavering intensity. "Yes, and every black passenger on your flights knew it." Rachel looked away, her chest tightening painfully. The weight of recognition, of truly seeing herself through others' eyes for the first time, felt almost unbearable. She'd been Ashley. She'd been that same source of pain, that same reminder to countless passengers that they weren't welcome, weren't valued, weren't equal. The realization sat heavy in her chest, making it hard to breathe, her throat constricting around a sob she refused to release. Days later, the morning sun cast long shadows across the airport terminal as Rachel adjusted her uniform one last time. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed down the fabric, knowing this would likely be the last time she'd wear it. After a week of intense lessons and revelations, she understood perfectly well why she deserved to be fired. The weight of her actions pressed down on her shoulders like an invisible burden she could no longer ignore. The security guard who'd been escorting her all week appeared at her door. "Ms. Carter is ready for you." Rachel nodded, following him through the familiar corridors. Her footsteps echoed in the empty hallway, each step bringing her closer to what she assumed would be her final moments as an airline employee. She'd spent the night rehearsing what she'd say when Vanessa fired her, preparing herself for the inevitable end of her career. The words had tumbled around in her mind until dawn broke, leaving her exhausted but resigned. But when they reached their destination, Rachel froze. Instead of Vanessa's office, they stood before the main conference room. Through the glass walls, she could see dozens of people inside. Airline executives in their crisp suits, flight attendants in their uniforms, ground crew members still in their work clothes. Her heart began to race, pounding against her ribcage like a trapped bird. Vanessa stood at the entrance, her expression neutral as always. "Come in, Rachel." Rachel's legs felt like lead as she entered the room. Every face turned to look at her, and she recognized many of them from her week of training. The cleaning staff she'd worked alongside on day one, their hands still rough from years of labor. The customer service representatives who'd let her listen to complaints, their patient smiles masking years of abuse from entitled passengers. The former employees who'd shared their stories of discrimination, their voices still tinged with pain at the memories. And there, in the front row, sat Mrs. Jackson, her presence commanding attention without saying a word. Her weathered face held decades of struggle and dignity that Rachel was only beginning to comprehend. Vanessa moved to the center of the room. "Everyone here knows why we're gathered. They've been briefed on your week of training." She paused, looking directly at Rachel. "They have one question for you. What did you learn?" The room fell silent. Rachel felt dozens of eyes on her, waiting. She took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly together to stop them from shaking. The air felt thick with anticipation and judgment. "I was blind," she began, her voice quiet but clear. "I ignored things I should have seen." She glanced around the room, making eye contact with the ground crew members she'd once treated as invisible. "I made people feel invisible because I thought I was better than them. I thought my uniform, my position, gave me the right to decide who deserved respect and who didn't." Her voice cracked slightly, but she continued. "I watched other flight attendants do the same thing yesterday, and it was like looking in a mirror. I saw myself in every dismissive gesture, every fake smile, every moment someone was made to feel less than human." Rachel turned to face Mrs. Jackson directly. "I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to know. I see it now. I see how my actions hurt people. I see how I contributed to a system that's caused pain for generations. I see how my privilege made me think I could never be the villain in someone else's story." She swallowed hard, fighting back tears that burned behind her eyes. "I was wrong. I was so wrong, and I'm sorry. Not because I got caught, but because I finally understand the damage I've done." Rachel braced herself for the backlash, for angry voices to rise up and tell her it wasn't enough. But instead, there was silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy with unspoken thoughts and emotions, like the air before a storm breaks. Then, slowly, Mrs. Jackson stood up. The elderly woman's eyes held wisdom and weight as she looked at Rachel. After what felt like an eternity, she nodded. "That's a start." Those 3 simple words seemed to break a spell in the room. Some people nodded, others remained skeptical, but there was a subtle shift in the energy, not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the first step toward understanding. A tiny crack in a wall that had seemed impenetrable just moments before. Vanessa dismissed the meeting shortly after. As people filed out, some glanced at Rachel with various expressions, some thoughtful, others still wary. Rachel remained rooted to her spot until the room was nearly empty, feeling both hollow and somehow fuller than she'd ever been. Finally, she turned and walked out into the hallway, emotionally drained. Her legs felt weak, and she leaned against the wall, closing her eyes. The cool surface against her back was the only thing that felt real in that moment. Footsteps approached, and she opened her eyes to see Vanessa standing before her, her posture straight and unyielding. "This doesn't erase what you did," Vanessa said firmly, "but at least now you understand." Rachel nodded, feeling the truth of those words in her bones. She couldn't change the past, couldn't take back the hurt she'd caused or the people she'd damaged. But for the first time in her life, she wanted to be better. Not for her career, not for her reputation, but because she finally understood the weight of her actions and the responsibility she carried. The path forward would be difficult, but for once, it was the right one. Later, Rachel sat in the hard plastic chair outside Vanessa's office, her hands folded neatly in her lap to hide their trembling. The corridor felt different now, colder, more sterile than when she'd walked these halls with authority just a week ago. The morning sunlight streamed through nearby windows, casting long shadows that seemed to point accusingly at her. She watched as airline employees passed by, some averting their eyes while others stared openly. News of her week-long punishment had spread throughout the company. Rachel didn't blame them for staring. She would have done the same before. Her uniform, freshly pressed for what she assumed would be the last time, felt heavy on her shoulders. The wings pinned to her chest, once a source of pride, now felt like a weight. She'd earned those wings, yes, but she'd never truly honored what they represented. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second bringing her closer to what she knew would be her final moments as an airline employee. She'd spent the night preparing for this, rehearsing graceful acceptance of her termination, planning how to hand over her ID badge, thinking about what she'd say in her final moments. The door to Vanessa's office opened with a soft click. Rachel straightened automatically, a reflex from years of maintaining perfect posture. Vanessa stepped out, her expression unreadable as always. She studied Rachel for a long moment, her gaze steady and evaluating. Rachel waited for the words she knew were coming, the formal dismissal, the request for her badge. Instead, Vanessa's next words caught her completely off guard. "Before I fire you, there's one last thing you need to do." Rachel blinked, confusion momentarily replacing her resignation. "What?" Without answering immediately, Vanessa reached into a folder she was carrying and withdrew a printed document. She held it out to Rachel, who took it with slightly trembling fingers. It was a flight itinerary, complete with crew assignments and passenger manifests. Rachel's eyes scanned the document, noting the departure time, route, and other details. But something felt off. These weren't her usual assignments. "This isn't mine," she said, looking up at Vanessa with confusion. Vanessa's lips curved into a slight smile, though her eyes remained serious. "It is. You're working one last flight." Rachel felt her stomach drop. The thought of stepping onto another plane, of facing passengers again after everything she'd learned about herself, made her throat tight with anxiety. She'd been prepared for termination, had accepted it as the fitting end to her career. This was unexpected, unsettling. "One final shift," Vanessa continued, her voice firm but not unkind. "You've seen the damage you caused. Now, you fix it. For one day, you're a real flight attendant. You do it right." Rachel stared at the itinerary in her hands, really seeing it now. It was a full flight, Chicago to Los Angeles, departing in 2 hours. Her eyes caught on specific details: several elderly passengers, a family with young children, passengers with dietary restrictions, someone requiring wheelchair assistance. In the past, she would have skimmed these details, treating them as inconveniences rather than human beings with needs. Now, each note carried weight, representing real people who deserved respect and care. Rachel nodded slowly, her fingers tightening on the paper. She didn't argue or try to defend herself. Those impulses had been stripped away during her week of training. Instead, she felt something new, a mix of fear and determination. "When do I start?" she asked quietly. "Report to Gate B-17 in 30 minutes, Vanessa replied. "The crew has been briefed about your situation. They know this is your last chance." Rachel stood, clutching the itinerary like a lifeline. She turned to leave, but Vanessa's voice stopped her. "Rachel." She turned back. "Remember everything you learned this week. Every story. Every face. Every lesson. This isn't about saving your job anymore. It's about proving you can be better." Rachel nodded again, understanding the weight of what Vanessa was saying. This wasn't just another shift. It was a test of everything she'd learned, everything she claimed to understand now. She made her way to the crew locker room, her mind racing with thoughts of the upcoming flight. The room was empty when she entered, giving her a moment of privacy as she stood before her locker. She opened it slowly, revealing her spare uniform hanging inside. With careful movements, she began to dress. Each button she fastened felt different now. The fabric against her skin wasn't just a uniform anymore. It was a responsibility. The wings she pinned to her chest weren't just a symbol of authority, but a promise to do better. She looked at herself in the mirror, really looked. The reflection showed the same person who had abused her position, who had made others feel small to make herself feel big. But behind her eyes was something new: understanding, humility, and the weight of accountability. For the first time in her career, Rachel felt the true weight of responsibility that came with her uniform. It wasn't about power anymore. It was about service, about treating every passenger with the dignity they deserved. She checked her appearance one final time, smoothing down her jacket and adjusting her scarf. Then, taking a deep breath, She picked up her flight bag and headed toward Gate B-17. The familiar sounds of the airport surrounded her, announcements echoing overhead, the hum of conversations, rolling suitcases on tile floors. But everything felt different now. She noticed details she'd overlooked before. The elderly man struggling with his carry-on, the young mother trying to calm a crying baby, the businessman rushing past without seeing anyone around him. Rachel approached the gate area where her new crew members were already gathering for the pre-flight briefing. She could feel their eyes on her, could sense their wariness. They'd been told about her week of training, about this being her last chance. She stepped onto the plane, the familiar narrow aisle stretching before her. The empty seats waited to be filled with passengers, real people with real needs, real feelings, real dignity. It was time to prove who she really was, not through words or promises, but through actions. Rachel stood at the aircraft entrance, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The familiar pre-boarding announcements echoed through the cabin, but everything felt different now. Her usual confident stance had been replaced by something more hesitant, more aware. The first passengers began making their way down the jet bridge. Rachel's throat tightened as she spotted a black mother holding her young son's hand. The boy couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, just like Elijah. The memory of that day, of Vanessa and her son, hit Rachel like a physical blow. She saw herself through their eyes. The cruel smirk, the dismissive tone, the casual cruelty she'd wielded like a weapon. Rachel swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay present. The mother and son approached the doorway, their boarding passes ready. The little boy clutched a worn stuffed elephant, watching Rachel with the same wariness she'd seen in Elijah's eyes. "Welcome aboard," Rachel said, surprising herself with the genuine warmth in her voice. She bent down slightly, addressing the boy directly. "I like your elephant. Does he have a name?" The boy's eyes widened slightly, then he smiled. "Tommy," he whispered. "Well, Tommy's very lucky to have such a good friend to travel with," Rachel said softly. She straightened up, meeting the mother's surprised gaze. "You're in 14C and D. Would you like help finding your seats?" The mother shook her head, but her expression had softened. "We'll manage, thank you." As more passengers boarded, Rachel maintained her focus. Each person who stepped through that door was no longer just a seat number or a task to be completed. They were human beings, each carrying their own stories, their own struggles, their own dignity. An elderly couple approached, the husband supporting his wife as she walked slowly. Rachel immediately stepped forward. "Let me help you with those bags." She lifted their carry-ons carefully, noting how the wife's hands trembled slightly as she gripped her boarding pass. "Such a sweet girl," the wife murmured as Rachel escorted them to their seats, storing their bags in the overhead compartment and ensuring they were comfortable. The flow of passengers continued. Rachel spotted a Latina mother struggling with a heavy bag while trying to keep track of 2 small children. Without hesitation, Rachel moved to help, lifting the bag easily. "Gracias," the mother said, relief evident in her voice. "De nada," Rachel replied, one of the few Spanish phrases she knew. She made a mental note to learn more. How many times had she ignored passengers who weren't comfortable with English? A few rows back, an elderly black man was having trouble with his seatbelt. In the past, Rachel would have walked past, pretending not to notice. Today, she knelt beside his seat. "May I help you with that, sir?" she asked gently. The man looked surprised, then grateful. "These things get more complicated every year," he chuckled. Rachel adjusted the belt, making sure it was secure but comfortable. "There you go. Please don't hesitate to ask if you need anything else during the flight." As she stood up, Rachel noticed a Middle Eastern passenger receiving nervous glances from some of the other travelers. The man kept his eyes down, clearly used to such treatment. Rachel felt a familiar shame twist in her stomach. How many times had she contributed to making passengers feel this way? She approached his seat with a warm smile. "Would you like some water before we take off? Or perhaps an extra pillow?" The man looked up, startled by the direct attention. "Water would be nice, thank you." Throughout the flight, Rachel moved through the cabin with new awareness. Every interaction was an opportunity to do better, to be better. She checked on passengers regularly, anticipated needs before they arose, and treated everyone with the same level of respect and attention she'd once reserved for only certain travelers. During a quiet moment in the galley, Rachel overheard a young white flight attendant speaking to another crew member. The girl sighed heavily, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Ugh, why are they making a big deal about pre-boarding?" Rachel froze. The tone, the dismissive attitude. It was like looking into a mirror of her past self. She saw everything she used to be in this young woman's casual prejudice. Without hesitation, Rachel turned around. "We don't talk like that here," she said firmly, but quietly. The young flight attendant stiffened, her cheeks flushing. She nodded quickly, caught off guard by the reprimand from someone she'd heard was usually on the other side of such comments. Rachel felt something strange in that moment, a sense of responsibility she'd never experienced before. She wasn't just changing her own behavior, she was actively protecting the very people she'd once ignored or dismissed. It felt right, like finally stepping into the role she should have been playing all along. As the flight progressed, Rachel maintained her new approach. She helped an elderly woman to the bathroom, made sure a young mother had everything she needed to keep her baby comfortable, and stepped in when she noticed a businessman being unnecessarily rude to another passenger. When the plane finally landed and passengers began to depart, Rachel stood at the exit, thanking each person as they left. The black mother from earlier paused as she reached the door, her son still clutching Tommy the elephant. She looked at Rachel with a thoughtful expression. "You're different," she said simply. Rachel felt her eyes burning with unexpected tears. "I'm trying to be," she replied softly, the words catching in her throat. Hours later, Rachel sat in the leather chair across from Vanessa's desk, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The morning sun filtered through the large office windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Her flight attendant uniform felt stiff and uncomfortable, perhaps because she knew it would be the last time she'd wear it. The past week had changed everything. Each lesson, each confrontation, each painful revelation had stripped away layers of denial and privilege she hadn't even known she carried. Now, sitting here in the aftermath, Rachel felt raw but oddly cleansed, like a wound that had finally been properly cleaned after festering for years. Vanessa leaned forward in her chair, her dark eyes studying Rachel with the same intensity she'd shown throughout this entire process. The airline CEO's posture was straight, dignified, a woman who had built her success by seeing through people's facades. Her voice was calm but firm as she asked, "Tell me what you learned." Rachel exhaled slowly. She'd spent countless hours thinking about this moment, lying awake in her temporary dormitory, replaying every interaction, every mistake, every cruel word she'd ever spoken. The memories had kept her tossing and turning until dawn. The answer didn't come quickly. It couldn't. It needed the weight of truth behind it. "I didn't just make mistakes," Rachel began, her voice steady despite the emotion building in her chest. "I hurt people. Real people with real lives and real feelings." She paused, remembering Camille's face, the pain in her eyes when she described how Rachel's actions had destroyed her career, Mrs. Jackson's quiet dignity, the countless passengers she dismissed over the years with a raised eyebrow or a deliberately slow response. I was blind to things I should have seen, things that were right in front of me every single day. Rachel's fingers twisted together as she continued, knuckles whitening with the pressure. People like me, white, privileged, we get away with too much. And people like you have to fight too hard to be treated fairly. The words felt inadequate compared to the depth of understanding she'd gained, but she pressed on. "I watched that flight crew yesterday, and I saw myself in that young attendant's casual cruelty. I used to think I was just doing my job, but I was perpetuating something ugly and wrong." Her voice wavered slightly as she met Vanessa's gaze. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I won't be the same person ever again. I can't be. Not after everything I've seen and learned." The office fell silent. Only the distant hum of the building's air conditioning system filled the space between them. Vanessa's expression remained unreadable as she considered Rachel's words, her fingertips pressed together in a contemplative steeple. Then, with deliberate slowness, she reached into her desk drawer and withdrew a document. She slid it across the polished desktop toward Rachel. Rachel's heart sank. This was it. The termination she'd been expecting. A lump formed in her throat as she reached for the paper. But as she glanced at the document, her brow furrowed in confusion. This wasn't a termination letter at all. The header read, "Employment offer," and the position listed made her do a double take. "I don't understand," Rachel stammered, looking up at Vanessa with wide eyes, her lips parted in surprise. A faint smile crossed Vanessa's face, the first real smile Rachel had seen from her all week. "You don't deserve to be a flight attendant," Vanessa said plainly. "You've outgrown that. I'm offering you a different job, diversity training." Rachel's jaw dropped. The paper trembled slightly in her hands as she stared at it, then back at Vanessa. "You want me to teach people like me?" The idea seemed impossible, almost absurd, like asking a reformed thief to teach ethics. Vanessa nodded, her expression serious but not unkind. "Who better?" She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands on the desk. "You've experienced both sides now. You know exactly how privilege blinds us, how casual cruelty becomes normal, how easy it is to dismiss others' humanity. And more importantly, you know the path to changing that mindset." Rachel looked down at the offer letter again, her mind racing. The position would involve developing and conducting training programs for airline staff at all levels. She would be responsible for helping others recognize and address their own biases, teaching them the lessons she'd learned so painfully. She would have to stand before people and admit her own failures, use her story as both warning and inspiration. The salary was less than she'd made as a senior flight attendant. The hours would be longer, the work would be harder, emotionally and mentally demanding in ways her previous job had never been. She would face resistance, skepticism, and probably hostility from people who were just like she used to be. People who would roll their eyes and cross their arms, convinced they had nothing to learn. But she understood now why Vanessa was offering this chance. This wasn't about forgiveness or redemption. It was about responsibility, about taking the harsh lessons she'd learned and using them to create real change, about preventing others from causing the same harm she had inflicted for so many years. Rachel clutched the paper, feeling its weight, not just the physical weight, but the weight of choice it represented. She could walk away from all of this, find another airline job, try to forget everything she'd learned and move on with her life. Or she could dedicate herself to fixing what she had helped break, to preventing others from causing the same kind of harm she had inflicted for so many years. After a long moment, she lifted her head and whispered, "I'll do it." Rachel stood at the front of the training room, her hands clasped tightly behind her back to hide their slight trembling. The space was filled with fresh-faced flight attendants, their new uniforms still crisp and spotless. Their eager expressions reminded her of herself years ago, when she'd thought she knew everything about this job. Now she knew better. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting a warm glow across the rows of chairs. The room smelled of fresh coffee and new carpet. On the wall behind her, a projector displayed the Horizon Airlines logo, a sight that once filled her with pride for entirely different reasons. "Good morning," Rachel began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm Rachel Myers, and I'm here to talk to you about something that matters more than any safety procedure or service protocol you'll learn during your training." She paused, scanning the faces before her. Young, old, white, black, Asian, Hispanic. This class was more diverse than any she'd trained with. That wasn't an accident. Vanessa had made sure of it. "I'm going to tell you a story," Rachel continued. "It's not a nice story. It's not the kind that makes the storyteller look good. But it's true, and it's important." She moved from behind the podium, choosing instead to perch on the edge of the desk. The casual position felt more honest, more vulnerable, just like the truth she was about to share. 6 months ago, I was a senior flight attendant with this airline. I was good at my job, technically speaking. I knew every procedure, every protocol, every rule in the book. Rachel's lips curved in a bitter smile. What I didn't know was how to be a decent human being. The room fell silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers and clicking of pens stopped. I discriminated against passengers of color. Not openly, I was too professional for that. But I did it through subtle dismissals, through selective service, through assumptions I never questioned. Rachel's voice grew quieter, but in the stillness of the room every word carried. I made people feel small, feel unwelcome, feel less than human. She saw a few uncomfortable shifts in the audience. Good. Discomfort meant they were listening. Then one day I picked the wrong passenger to discriminate against. Rachel straightened up. Her name was Vanessa Carter. She happened to be the owner of this airline, and instead of firing me on the spot, which she had every right to do, she decided to teach me a lesson. For the next hour, Rachel laid bare every painful detail of her journey, the week of ground crew work that broke down her pride, the confrontations with former employees she'd hurt, the elderly Mrs. Jackson's quiet dignity in the face of decades of discrimination, the Civil Rights Museum visit that opened her eyes to the weight of history, the devastating conversation with Camille, the colleague she'd helped push out of her job. She described her final test flight, where she'd had to prove she could be better. How different it felt to serve passengers with genuine respect and empathy. How it had changed her perspective forever. The room remained silent throughout her story, but Rachel could see the impact in their faces. Some looked shocked, others thoughtful. A few nodded in recognition. They'd probably experienced similar treatment themselves. When she finished speaking, a young white flight attendant in the front row hesitated before raising her hand. Her voice was soft but clear. "What made you realize you were wrong?" Rachel paused, considering the question. The answer seemed both simple and impossibly complex. She smiled slightly, remembering those intense days of learning. "Someone finally made me listen," she said. "Really listen. Not just to words, but to experiences, to pain, to history. And once I started listening, I couldn't stop hearing the truth." She straightened up, her voice growing stronger. "That's what I want you to understand. This job isn't just about serving drinks or demonstrating safety procedures. It's about treating every single passenger, every single human being, with the dignity and respect they deserve. Not because they might turn out to be the airline owner, but because it's right." After the session, Rachel walked through the familiar airport corridors, but everything felt different. Where she once hurried past without seeing, now she noticed everything. A black family being warmly welcomed at the first-class check-in counter, a Muslim woman passing through security without unnecessary random checks, a white flight attendant rushing to help a black mother struggling with her luggage and toddler. Small changes perhaps, but significant ones. Changes that showed the airline's new policies and new training were making a difference. Near one of the terminals, she spotted a familiar pair of figures. Vanessa Carter stood tall and elegant as always, holding her son Elijah's hand. The little boy's face lit up when he saw Rachel, and he waved enthusiastically. Rachel waved back, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Shame for who she used to be, gratitude for the chance to change, determination to help others learn what she had learned. Looking at Vanessa and Elijah, Rachel finally understood something important. She was never meant to be the hero of this story. She had been the villain, and then she became something else. Not a hero, but a bridge. A person who could help others recognize their own biases and choose to be better. That was enough. That was everything. Rachel sat at her desk in the Diversity and Inclusion office, surrounded by training materials and feedback forms. The morning sun filtered through the blinds, casting thin stripes of light across her workspace. 6 months had passed since she'd taken on this new role, and slowly but surely she'd been rebuilding herself from the ground up. The office walls displayed colorful posters promoting inclusivity and respect, constant reminders of her mission and the person she was striving to become. A framed photo on her desk showed her latest training class, their faces reflecting the diverse future she now worked to create. Next to it sat a small handwritten thank you note from a flight attendant who'd found the courage to report discrimination after hearing Rachel's story during orientation. She wasn't perfect. Sometimes old thoughts still crept in. automatic reactions and judgments she had to consciously recognize and correct. But she was better. Each day brought new understanding, new perspectives, and new opportunities to make things right in ways both small and significant. The journey wasn't easy. There were days when shame threatened to overwhelm her, but she pressed forward anyway, determined to turn her mistakes into lessons for others. Rachel was reviewing curriculum updates for next month's sensitivity training when her phone buzzed against the desk. The name on the screen made her heart stop and her breath catch. Camille Jones. Her hand trembled as she stared at the incoming call. Camille, the black flight attendant she'd helped push out years ago through a campaign of subtle undermining. The woman whose promising career she'd damaged through 1,000 small cruelties and deliberate exclusions. Their last conversation, during Rachel's week of reckoning with Vanessa, still haunted her dreams. The raw pain in Camille's voice that day had stripped away Rachel's last defenses, forcing her to truly see herself for the first time. The phone continued buzzing insistently. Rachel's throat felt tight and dry. She almost let it go to voicemail, almost chose the coward's way out. But she remembered Vanessa's words from months ago. If you walk away now, you prove everything they said about you was right all along. Rachel picked up the phone. Hello? Her voice came out barely above a whisper, uncertain and afraid. Rachel. Camille's voice was steady, controlled. Not angry, but not warm either. Professional, measured. I heard you changed. Rachel's free hand gripped the edge of her desk until her knuckles turned white. I'm trying, she managed to say. The words felt woefully inadequate against the weight of their shared history and all the harm she'd caused. She wanted to say more but couldn't find words big enough to span the gulf between them. There was a long pause on the line. Rachel could hear soft breathing, could almost feel Camille weighing her next words carefully. Then, I'm glad. Those two simple words hit Rachel harder than any accusation could have. She felt tears welling up in her eyes, blurring her vision. She had expected, maybe even wanted, Camille to be angry, to yell, to hold on to resentment. That would have been easier to face than this quiet acknowledgement of her efforts. Rachel struggled to find words that wouldn't sound hollow. Camille, I'm so sorry for everything I did to you. Her voice cracked as she spoke, the full weight of her past actions pressing down on her chest. I know, Camille replied. Her voice carried something that sounded like relief, and that was worse than anger could ever be. Relief that someone who had hurt her had finally recognized the damage they'd caused. Relief that maybe, just maybe, others wouldn't have to go through what she did. Camille continued. The new flight attendants, they talk about your training sessions, about how you make them understand things they never noticed before, how you use your own mistakes as teaching moments. Rachel wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, smudging her mascara. It's the least I can do. After everything ... Yes, Camille agreed simply. It is the least you can do, but you're doing it. That matters in ways you might not even realize. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared past hanging between them like an invisible thread. Then Camille spoke again, her voice softer but still firm. I didn't call to absolve you, Rachel. What you did, what people like you did, it changed my life, not for the better. I know, Rachel whispered, her chest tight with shame. But, Camille continued, I called because sometimes change has to start somewhere, and sometimes it starts with people admitting they were wrong and actually doing something about it. Rachel closed her eyes, letting Camille's words sink in. When she opened them again, her gaze fell on the training materials spread across her desk, presentations about unconscious bias, case studies about discrimination, testimonials from affected employees who'd been brave enough to share their stories. She thought about how many times she'd dismissed similar materials in her previous life, rolling her eyes at what she'd once called political correctness gone mad. Thank you, Rachel said finally, for calling, for being willing to see that I'm trying to be different, to be better. Just keep doing the work, Camille replied. Make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else on your watch. After they said goodbye, Rachel set the phone down with shaking hands. She exhaled slowly, feeling the full weight of the conversation settle over her like a heavy blanket. For the first time, she truly understood. She would never be able to undo the harm she had caused. She couldn't rewrite history or give Camille back the career she'd lost through her actions. But she could make sure no one else like Camille would go through it again. That would have to be enough. It would never erase the past, but it could help create a better future. With renewed determination, Rachel turned back to her work, knowing that redemption wasn't a destination but a lifelong journey of making different choices every single day. Rachel stood near the terminal gate, watching passengers file through security. Her corporate ID badge hung from her neck, a stark reminder of how much her life had changed in the past 6 months. She wasn't here to work a flight today. Those days were behind her. Instead, she was observing, making notes for her next training session. The morning bustle filled the airport with familiar sounds, rolling suitcases, announcement chimes, and the constant hum of conversations. Rachel checked her watch. Flight 2187 would begin boarding soon. She knew this because she'd specifically chosen to be here today. It was Vanessa's regular flight with Elijah. As if on cue, she spotted them approaching the gate. Vanessa walked with her usual quiet confidence, holding Elijah's small hand. The boy skipped alongside his mother, clutching a toy airplane in his free hand. Rachel noticed how different the scene was from that fateful day 6 months ago. A young flight attendant stood at the gate, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun. Rachel watched intently as a black mother with 2 children approached the counter. This was the moment, the kind of interaction that Rachel herself had handled so poorly in the past. The flight attendant's face lit up with a genuine smile. "Good morning. Welcome aboard." She knelt down to the children's eye level. "And hello to you two. Would you like some wings pins for your journey?" Rachel felt her chest warm as she watched the scene unfold. The mother's shoulders relaxed, clearly accustomed to a different kind of treatment. The children beamed as they received their pins, and the flight attendant efficiently processed their boarding passes while maintaining friendly conversation. This was what change looked like. Small moments, human interactions, dignity preserved instead of stripped away. Rachel had helped train this flight attendant, had shared her own story as a cautionary tale during orientation. Seeing the results in person made her throat tight with emotion. She was about to turn away, satisfied with her observations, when she heard a familiar voice. "Rachel?" She turned to find Vanessa looking at her, one eyebrow raised in that knowing way of hers. Elijah stood beside his mother, his face lighting up with recognition. Rachel hesitated. Even after all this time, facing Vanessa and Elijah stirred up complicated feelings. Shame mixed with gratitude, regret tangled with hope. But she walked over to them, forcing a small smile. Before she could speak, Elijah bounced forward, holding up his toy plane with enthusiasm. "Miss Rachel, I remember you." The words caught her off guard. Rachel blinked, surprised by the child's cheerful greeting. "You do?" Elijah nodded vigorously, his innocent face breaking into a wide grin. "You're the mean lady who got nice." Rachel felt her body stiffen at the blunt description. Then, something unexpected happened. She laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a genuine laugh that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her. Because of course that's how a child would see it. No complex explanations, no careful corporate language about growth and learning. Just the simple truth. She had been mean, and now she was nice. "Yeah," she managed through her laughter, wiping at her eyes. "That's me." Vanessa stood watching this exchange, a knowing smirk playing at her lips. "You did good, Rachel." Those 4 words coming from Vanessa meant more than any corporate commendation ever could. Rachel felt her throat tighten again, but this time with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, meaning it with every fiber of her being. The gate agent announced the start of boarding. Vanessa placed a gentle hand on Elijah's shoulder, guiding him toward the jet bridge. Rachel watched them go, struck by how different this scene was from their last encounter at this very gate. She remained rooted to the spot, taking in the bustling airport around her. Everywhere she looked, she saw what she had once been blind to: a Muslim woman in a hijab being treated with respect at security, An elderly black man receiving assistance with his bags without having to ask twice. A group of Latino passengers chatting freely in Spanish without receiving disapproving glares. The airport wasn't perfect. Rachel knew better than anyone that discrimination didn't disappear overnight. But things were changing. She could see it in the small interactions, the subtle shifts in behavior, the growing awareness among staff. She watched as passengers of all races moved freely through the terminal, treated with the dignity they had always deserved. There was still more work to do. So much more. But for the first time since her transformation began, Rachel didn't feel the crushing weight of shame when she thought about who she used to be. Instead, she felt something new. Pride. Not in who she had been, but in who she was becoming. In the changes she helped create, one training session at a time. In the small victories she witnessed, like the young flight attendant's warm welcome to that black family. With one last glance at the gate where Vanessa and Elijah had disappeared, Rachel turned and walked away. Her steps were steady, purposeful. She had work to do. If you enjoyed the story of Vanessa, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Don't miss it. Click here to watch it. She had work to do. If you enjoyed the story of Vanessa, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Don't miss it. Click here to watch it.